the Tories here to stay, it's about the rise. Scottish Conservatives.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
Obviously, they're the second biggest party now, and it's a big shot. And where I come from, which is Tories, my councillor, one of my councillors out of the four is a Tory councillor. He's called Thomas Kerr, and he's 21, I think.
Yes.
And we've also got Ari Wells, who I interviewed the other day. And
welcome to proportional representation.
well, yeah, but they're very different from the normal Tories, but they're also quite popular.
Yes.
Yes. So my first question is, what role does Scottish independence play in the success of the Tories and in the ongoing fight from independent voters and the SNP?
Okay, it does and it doesn't. If we date the revival of the Conservative Party from 2015 and going through to 2017, so essentially the first piece of evidence is the 2016 Scottish Parliament election, then followed by the 2017 local elections and then the general election shortly thereafterwards. The debate about independence and the debate about IndyRef 2 does look as though it's important in the first period. I mean, between 2015 and 2016, in the sense that during that period, the gains that the Conservative Party made were indeed predominantly amongst no voters, and they included gains from the Labour Party. So people were going from Labour to Conservative. So the truth is that I think the weak position in which the Labour Party found itself after the 2015 general election, whereas on the other side of the fence, Labour, arguing about its leadership, and also sometimes striking a somewhat uncertain note about independence question. Sometimes Labour Party just sounded like can we just talk about anything else? We'll talk about schools or hospitals or policemen, but please can we not talk about independence? So they were struggling on this issue because they knew partly their voters were internally divided. The Conservative Party, in contrast, struck a confident note. And of course, Ruth Davidson is a very effective political leader. And by taking the stance against, and then using the fact that Nicola Sturgeon was keeping alive the possibility of a second independence referendum, we're using that foil to play on that issue. And the truth is, Ruth Davidson would keep on saying that, the SNP are obsessed with independence. Well, actually, it was the Conservative Party that was obsessed about independence. They talked about it far more than anybody else because it was bringing them dividends. But anyway, if you look at the polling evidence, the increase, it's the combination of the weakness of the Labour Party and Ruth Davidson's ability to exploit, I don't mean that pejoratively, but to take advantage of the political messages of the SNP to begin to make the Conservative Party look like the principal party in favour of the Union. And that's the story from 2015 to 2016. The story there, however, thereafter is different. The increase in conservative support beyond the 22-23% of the 2016 Scottish Parliament election and the vote, the 29% vote that they got in the general election in 2017, that was the product of gaining votes amongst Leave voters. So despite Ruth Davidson's personal position, the dynamics of the increase of Conservative support in that period is very similar to that of the party south of the border. They just simply gained votes among Leave voters. Now, this means, for example, that something like 8% of those people who voted SNP in 2015 voted for the Conservatives because they were Leave voters. All right, but they are not. But the Conservative vote does not particularly. I mean, the rise in Conservative support between 2016 and 2017 is just as high amongst yes voters as it is amongst no voters. It's not to do with IndyRef 2. It's all to do with Leave, and it's to do with the UK Conservative Party's position on Leave, not the Scottish Conservative Party's position. So, and then I think there's then two other points to make in the wake of 2017. The first is that at this point 12 months ago, it looked possible that the Scottish Conservative Party would manage to become not just a unionist party, but the unionist party, i.e. that it would come to dominate the unionist vote in the way that the SNP dominates the nationalist vote. Because the Labour Party was down to 15-16%, and it looked as though, well, actually, it really, really could get slaughtered. And particularly the local elections were important. Now, you've referred to local election successes. In my view, the local elections mark the point at which the possibility that the Tories were going to become the unionist party in Scotland, but that project stopped. Because the Labour Party emerged with 20% of the vote. Yes, it was weak and all the rest of it, but it was a hell of a lot better than it could have been. And then, of course, because then, 6 weeks later, there was the general election in which the Corbyn phenomenon helps the Labour Party north of the border a bit. And the unionist vote is now divided between Conservative and Labour and is back where it was. So, yes, the Conservative, none of that's to gainsay that the Conservative Party is in a strong position, but once you start now looking forward and you say, well, OK, where's the Conservative Party, Scottish Conservative Party going to come from now? Well, the crucial task that now faces it is to move from being a party of opposition, which is essentially what it's been so far, to being a party that actually could begin to persuade people in Scotland that it might present an alternative government. Mm-hmm. So far, the Conservative programme for government in Scotland is pretty weak. If you read the 2017 Conservative Manifesto in Scotland, compared with the UK one, it deletes various bits of the English manifesto, but doesn't really insert what the Scottish Conservative Party is going to do. So, but then the fundamental question that's facing is, well, OK, how are you going to form a government? I mean, if you manage to be the largest party in the Scottish Parliament, how are you going to manage to form a government? Because you're not going to get an overall majority. I mean, that's even less likely than ever happened to the SNP. And the answer is that at the moment, you're either going to have to do a deal with the SNP or the Labour Party, even if it's only of the kind of minority government kind of deal that you did with the SNP between 2007 and 2011. And I think that's a tough question for the Conservative Party to answer. And the Labour Party won't want to play ball. There's an irony about the current situation in Scotland, which is that actually, I think all of the other three parties in Scotland have a vested interest in a revival of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, because the Scottish Liberal Democrats potentially provide the coalition partners to Labour, Conservative and the SNP. Without the Liberal Democrats around, for coalition formation or even minority government agreements become much more difficult to form because there's no hinge party.
That's interesting. So a lot of what you say is what a lot of other people said as well. It's about the Labour Party. It's about many things, independence, the Labour Party, SB, Ruth Davidson. And I was wondering, the people who voted Conservative then, how does their policy goals differ from the Conservative, if it does, or are people voting despite policy goals? That's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering, when people vote Conservative in Scotland, are they saying, I agree with their policies, apart from independence, which a lot of them do? Is there anything else, or is it solely because of other factors? And not, is it like pro-Conservative, or is it anti-everything else?
The answer to you is that the Conservative Party in Scotland primarily gains votes amongst voters who you would describe as centre-right. Okay, I mean, one of the things that we do on Scottish Socialities is every year we ask people a series of questions about, how much should the government intervene in the economy, and how much should it be trying to promote equality, right? So you can work out people's left-right position from the answers to those questions. The Conservative Party does better amongst those on the right than on the left. Surprise, surprise. So to that extent, at least, the Conservative Party is getting the support disproportionate people whose broad values are, roughly speaking, in line with those of the Conservative Party. Okay. However, what was true, and I have to admit, I've got the data somewhere. It's a while since I've looked at it, but certainly historically, the problem all the way through to 2015 was that a lot of people in Scotland who are on the centre-right did not vote for the Conservatives. All right. So the picture, the argument that's often made that Scotland is, a social democratic country. Well, it's a little bit more social democratic, but it's not that much more social democratic than England. And the Tories' problem is that they weren't getting the votes of people on the centre right in the first place. Why? Because they were in the wrong place over devolution. They were in the wrong place in coming to be seen as being an English party rather than being a Scottish party. And from that, it's taken many years to recover. And it's taken, a very different kind of Scottish Conservative leader, but somebody who's definitely Scottish, to begin to turn that around. That said, the party is still inclined to pursue minority positions. I mean, it's not Davison's position. I mean, Scottish Conservatives are trying to get the UK government out of the mess, but the UK government's stance on the devolution of things like agriculture, etc., is getting the Conservative Party back in the wrong place again. But
the next question is, so if the Conservatives can continue to rise, as you said, they'll need to campaign.
Well, they're not. The answer to that is we already know they're not. Right?
So the SNP, in many people's opinions, have peaked. They peaked when they won their majority government, when they got their 56 MPs, and now they're on a slope. Have the Conservatives had a similar peak?
I mean, look, predicting the future is very difficult. I mean, all that one can say to you is that the Scottish Tories now are registering about 25% in the polls, not 29%.
Is that for UK or Scottish?
Well, it's both, actually.
Both?
So that therefore means they're still doing slightly better than they were in 2016.
Yeah.
But they're doing worse than they did in 2017. Okay. So at the moment, at least, there isn't any further progress, and if anything, they've probably slipped back a bit.
How do you see Brexit as? How could that affect the Conservatives? Because what seems to be the case is many voters they'll separate Scottish Conservatives from the UK Conservatives, and they'll say, well, I'm not a big fan. Even Annie Wells, I was talking to her, and she was saying, oh, well, it's the boys' club, it's the posh boys' club, and people like me as a person, people like Scottish Tories, people like Ruth Davidson.
Sure.
So why do you think that is?
Oh, well, because it's got the Conservative Party north and south of the border is predominantly a middle-class party, and people who from a rather more working-class background are going to be relatively exceptional. I mean, what was there he's now finished, but the only person from a working-class background in the last Conservative cabinet was Patrick, whatever he's called, the Scottish Tory. Not the Scottish Tory, the English Tory chairman. Sure. I mean, that's always going to be. But of course, one of the things that's true is that as a consequence of Brexit, on both sides of the border, the Conservative Party, because it's appealing to Leave voters, and Leave voters are disproportionately older. Well, that's fine. The Conservative Party had no trouble getting older voters, but also voters with less than of educational qualifications, and therefore more likely to be working class voters. The Conservative vote on both sides of the border is now more working class than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And in a sense, somebody like Annie Wells will kind of symbolise that to some degree. But that just. I mean, I've occasionally talked to. Conservative associations, because I occasionally get asked to talk to various things, and a classic Conservative association meeting will be a mixture of perhaps somebody who's the president, who perhaps is, well, to say they're the local laird is perhaps putting a bit too finely, but somebody with a relatively high social standing, a lot of middle class people, predominantly people involved in business, and then some people from more working class backgrounds. That mixture is always there, right? But it's always the kind of the more middle class end of the party that's. That's not to deny that the Labour Party is predominantly a middle class party in its membership these days either. That's just the nature of politics.
So in the polling research that I've looked at, it seems to be that age is now what class used to be in terms of.
Age is the principal social condition across the UK as a whole. So as young people in my age group, we looking at it was we didn't vote Conservative, and looking up, will that change, or how will the Conservatives appeal to young people so that they can get their vote, or at least when they're older?
they can get their vote, because that seems to be like, if they continue the way they are, if people from my age group grow up but their opinions on the Conservatives don't change, that could be disastrous for the Scottish Tories.
You're right, it could, and it's a $64,000 question. The answer to you is it's not retail politics. That is the argument that if the Conservative Party solves the housing crisis, I'm now talking about the Conservative Party south of the border, if it solves the housing crisis, or if it does something about university tuition fees in England, that as a result, younger people will be willing to come back to the party, I think is misguided. University tuition fees are a bit more unpopular amongst younger people than older people, but the truth is, parents get just as worried about the debt burden of university tuition fees as the children themselves. On housing, for example, the control of private sector rents is actually more popular amongst older people than younger people, believe it or not. Where younger people stand out is that they're much more likely to be socially liberal, they're much less concerned about immigration, they're much happier about living in a socially diverse society, and that the problem the Conservative Party faces is that the Brexit agenda is tied up with the immigration agenda, and the immigration agenda is not popular amongst younger people. That's the problem. And insofar as for the foreseeable future, the Conservative Party is stuck with sorting out Brexit, it's going to find it difficult to get out of this. Now, what happens beyond that? I think, fascinating. We can't necessarily assume that today's younger people will remain eternally socially liberal. After all, the people who voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, amongst the over 60s, were people who voted to stay in the common market 40 years previously. So it's an open question.
Do you think
but it's a problem.
Do you think opinions can definitely change then in regards to that?
Well, they might. I think it's a fascinating question, for example, that one can hypothesize that one of the reasons why today's younger people are ready for conservative immigration is that they have been brought up in a society in which there are lots of Poles and people speaking Punjabi, etc., and they're kind of used to it. But then ask yourself, well, what do you think might happen if in 20 years' time your generation experiences high levels of migration from mainland China, which is, again, a cultural group that we've only got a small Chinese population, which uses a different hieroglyphics, has yet again another different religious culture, etc. I think it's an open question as to whether or not you would then be saying, this is not the country I was brought up in, right?
Yeah. So what's been put to me a lot is that the SNP need the Conservatives and the Conservatives need the SNP. Is that true? Do they need each other for one party to do well?
Well, certainly my explanation as to why the Conservative Party made progress in 2015 and 2016 is in part using the SNP as a foil, yes, undoubtedly. And it's certainly true. Well, it's certainly true that the SNP is still inclined to believe that if you label something as being Tory, that people in Scotland will automatically hate it. Now, I think on the second they're wrong. Okay, the days when people are going to say it's wrong in Scotland are going to say it's wrong simply because it's supported by the Conservatives. Mm-hmm. But look, one of the lessons of the Scottish Tory revival is that the Scottish Tories are back in the game. That's a very difficult line. I think, to keep on pursuing, and the SNP would be wiser to argue the merits of the case rather than on issues, rather than kind of throwing mud.
For policy rather than just
occasionally, sometimes the SNP, of course, the Tories will be on the wrong side of the argument, in which case you say so. But
does policy work though? Does arguments on policy work more than other arguments, like big ideas and things that are more abstract?
There are two crucial things you need to be able to be effective in election. You need to have a narrative, i.e. you need to have a story of the kind of government you're going to be and the kind of country you're going to create, and you need to persuade people you can deliver it. Okay. Now, policy matters insofar as it helps you to sustain a narrative in which people begin to have faith and which suggests that you actually would be capable of delivering it. That's how it matters. Voters won't, and it's in the broad synoptic messages you're sending out, voters for the most part won't follow the detail.
Yeah.
It's the broad messages they follow. But, I would take the view that the reason why the we need to move around a bit. Why the reason why the Conservative Party, why the Labour Party got into so much trouble as it did, was because it never developed a narrative of the kind of Scotland that it wanted to create.
Well, will that change under Richard Leonard? Because I read this poll and it said most people in Scotland don't know who Richard Leonard is. And I asked people that, I said, did you know that? And they said, who's Richard Leonard? And I asked Thomas Kerr that, and I asked if he was a threat, and he laughed. Do you think that's fair? Do you think he is a threat? Can he do anything?
Well, I'm looking forward to the Scottish Labour Party conference this week. This is his first opportunity, his first significant opportunity to get his message across. Some people would suggest that he's got some semblance of what he wants to do. He's a man who wants less inequality and all the rest of it. But these lads are definitely willing to come out, aren't they? Yeah. Maybe, hopefully, they're just on night time. That he wants, less inequality and all the rest of it. But his problem at the moment, I think, is that he's wanting to. He's not got the distinction. That's done it.
There you are.
He's not got the distinction between devolved and reserved policy, and a lot of what he talks about requires reserved policy. So when I talk about a narrative for Scottish elections, it has to be a narrative of the kind of Scotland you're going to create using the powers of the devolved Parliament. And I'm not sure that Leonard has yet got the last bit of it. But it's very early days. He insofar as he's got a similar broader stance than Corbyn, then we will read what he says with interest.
I interviewed your colleague, Dr. Neil McGarvey, and he said that there's always been a base of Scottish voters who are small C Conservatives, and that the Conservatives have just they've connected with those people. Do you think then they've locked in that vote? Because it seems to me like they're very, very confident these days. Or do you think their confidence is overstated because there's still a quarter?
Neil is right. As I suggested, the Scottish Tories' problem has been that they've not been sufficiently effective at winning over the votes of people whom you might think were ideologically close. To give you some idea. I'll give you one anecdote to kind of illustrate this story. I've occasionally given the odd talk involving parents at private schools in Edinburgh. Public schools in Edinburgh. Which, if you were doing this in England, this would be, as it were, a nest of Tories. Okay? Yeah. But they kind of say to you, but of course, we don't vote Conservative. They just regard, and I know some of them might do so now. I suspect they've got some of that group, but they just did not regard the Conservatives as an acceptable option because they just weren't Scottish enough and all the rest of it. So there undoubtedly is there's a constituency of Conservatives winning over, which I think they've now had some success in winning over. And it probably is capable of expansion, yes. Here the problem is the problem of party competition because, of course, although the SNP is presented by Nicola Sturgeon as a left-wing party, actually the SNP is quite effective also at picking up centre-right voters in Scotland. Some of the senior people inside the SNP are not left-wingers at all. So I think probably the SNP, to that extent at least, probably presents more in the way of competition. Your classic small businessman living in rural Scotland, kind of, it's a tough choice. Do you go for the SNP because they stand up for the interests of Scotland, or do you go for the Conservative Party because they stand up for business? That's a tough choice. I think that the SNP can appeal to some of that constituency, as they certainly used to do in the North East.
So who did those people used to vote for. The centre right, the small C Conservatives.
Well, they voted for the Conservative historically, yes. But once the SNP started to take off in the 1970s, then look at that vote that the SNP had in the North East, right? Voted Leave, a lot of them, which is why they've gone back to the Tories. But they were fishing, they were farmers. This is an area of small industry, and it was the SNP saying, "We will stand up for your distinctive interests."
The letter, I think it was 8 Scottish MPs signed. That was some would say in favour of a hard Brexit, of a no deal, things like that. Do you think that could run counter to them picking up any potential votes from young people who overwhelmingly voted to remain?
Yeah, well, as I've already said to you, the Scottish Tories are relying on a Leave electorate. All right, that's where the most recent gains have come from. Their vote is disproportionately Leave. That's what they've got, and that's what they're going to have to live with for the time being.